Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Our top story tonight is a statement by Joe Biden, a former vice president and the current U.S. presidential candidate for the Democrats, speaking at an event organized by the Indian American community, marking the 74th Indian Independence Day on August 15th. Biden said, and I quote, "I said if United States and India became closer friends and partners, then the world would be a safer place. If elected president, I would continue to believe it and continue what I've long called for, standing with India, confronting the threats it faces in its own region and along its borders," unquote. Some might dismiss this as campaign rhetoric, and since memories are short, it's instructive to remember that Biden, as chairman Senate Foreign Relations Committee, played a key role in congressional passage of the Indo-US civil nuclear deal. He formally supported a permanent role for India in a reformed/expanded UNSC and upgraded India's status to a major defense partner. The Biden campaign also shared with the media a major policy document which says Biden believes there can be no tolerance for terrorism in South Asia, cross-border or otherwise. A Biden administration will also work with India to support a rules-based and stable Indo-Pacific region in which no country, including China, is able to threaten its neighbors with impunity. While Trump opened a tariff war with India, as he did with China and also some of his NATO allies, there's a general sense that a Biden administration will take Washington back to a more traditional foreign policy, one which is structurally geared towards looking at China as a challenger that needs to be contained. How is it likely to pan out is what we're going to discuss tonight. We have with us Dr. Moeed Yusuf, Special Advisor to the Prime Minister on National Security Division and Chairman Policy Planning. We also have with us Elizabeth Threlkeld, a former U.S. Foreign Service officer who's now Deputy Director, South Asia Program at Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. And we're also joined by Colonel Cheng Xizhong, a visiting professor at Southwest University of Political Science and a former Chinese defense attaché in South Asian countries. Thank you to all my panelists. Let me begin with Moeed here. Moeed, it's always great to have you on the program. Let me ask you, taking a cue from my opening, shall I say, there are two ways of looking at what presidential aspirant Biden is trying to do. We can either dismiss it as a vote-garnering exercise or take it seriously. Well, given the system, how it works in and through traditional U.S. policy-making structures, are you worried?
Yes, look, I mean, I think it's not for me sitting here to decide what is good for the U.S. or not. At the end of the day, Pakistan as a state is going to work with whichever leader is in Washington or, for that matter, any other world capital. What it is going to entail for us, quite frankly, we have a very clear policy. And the policy is that we want peace in this region. Whoever is willing to help us get to that peace, we've asked the US in the past. The US current president has talked about mediation. We've welcomed that. Not because we think he's going to be in our favor or he's going to have a bias. I don't think that's true. I mean, your own opening talks about the fact that perhaps India and US, there's a greater likelihood of them coming together. Our point is very simple. If somebody stands for peace, they can join hands with us. If somebody wants to see India's agenda of expansionism furthered, we're of course not interested. We're not going to take advantage of anybody else in a situation where they may be stuck. But, Pakistan in this policy issue is agnostic. I mean, it's for the American people to decide. We will work with whichever president. We've had very good relations with Democratic presidents and Republican presidents in the past. So I really don't think there's any concern or worry or a thought. I mean, we will work and we will work towards peace in our region, and that's the most important thing for us.
That was a pretty diplomatic answer. But okay, let me take the conversation to your book and your brokered bargaining model. In fact, we were talking about that only yesterday or day before yesterday. Do you think your model will sustain if the U.S. enters the fray in South Asia? And Sino-India border dispute is now a South Asian affair, as a partisan more than a broker?
Take me back to my book. I hardly remember. Again, it's difficult for me to wear my scholarly hat, to be honest. What I'd say to that is, at the end of the day, I personally believe, but quite frankly, my scholarship has told me over the years, it's impossible for the world to look the other way if you have two nuclear powers, whoever they may be in whatever region, come to a head. So if you're talking about India and China, you're talking about Pakistan and India, it's not because a larger power, an external power, or a friend outside is pro one country or anti the other country. That's not the reason here. The reason, at least as I see it, is nobody in the world can afford two nuclear powers to come to a head in a way where a nuclear exchange becomes realistic. And you know this better than me, Ejaz. You've written about this for years. Once you have a conflict situation between two nuclear powers, nobody can guarantee you 100% that this won't go in that direction. So, I think it's not about a biased broker or a broker coming to back one. I don't think there's anybody in the world, any country in the world that would come in and try and settle scores, join hands with a partner or an ally against another nuclear power. Because what you'd be really saying here is that you're increasing the probability of a nuclear exchange and you're inviting a catastrophe. So, at the end of the day, I personally, I really just don't see how, in any circumstance, any country is going to take advantage of a real nuclear crisis. So I don't really worry about that. I think at the end of the day, the real question for a policymaker sitting in Pakistan, for somebody like me, is how do you not even think about that? How do you never get there? How do you always talk about peace? And for that, unfortunately, at this time, it takes two to tango, and our eastern neighbor simply doesn't seem to be moving in a direction where peace is on their agenda. It's very unfortunate, but that's the reality at the moment.
I understand what you're saying. I mean, it's not necessarily, leaning in favor of a particular country does not really mean, sending or, actually getting involved in fighting. There are other ways of doing this. So I really want to press you on this point, frankly. I mean, hypothetical it might be at this point. But frankly, what are we looking at if there's indeed a conflict between India and China and the US leans in favor of India?
Push me all you like, but, frankly, I just don't, my scholarship has never told me that that's a possibility. Leaning in one's favor, there was a lot of writing on this issue, a lot of conversation on this issue when Pulwama happened, that, well, actually the US came in and favored India. So I don't know what favored means here. If favored means that you have a partner in the region and you're going to back that partner, diplomatically, politically, rhetorically, maybe. But are you going to back a partner to fight a war with another nuclear power? If you go back in history and look at other crises in the Middle East, there was clear alliance preference at that time. Four superpowers of the time never happened. So, again, for Pakistan, I think it's academic. It really is hypothetical. We stand for peace. We're going to keep talking about we want Kashmir resolved how? Through international law, through UN resolutions. We want to talk about our disputes how? Through the length of human rights. So, this is not on our mind. It shouldn't be on our mind. We just want the world to realize that where India is moving, it is destabilizing the entire region. It's got all its neighbors upset at it. And this is where instability lies. So if the world really wants to help the region, it's India that they need to look at and make sure that it comes back to a pre-August 5th, 2019 status for Kashmir, so that we can really have a conversation and resolve the issue. If that issue is resolved, I think 80% of the problem that we face in this region will dissipate.
Okay, the rest of the discussion on this particular point we'll keep for some other day, but one final question before I let you go, since you're the NSA. A number of things are changing in and around us. Do we have the capacity to analyze and respond to them? I ask this also because I know that you want to change geopolitics through geoeconomics. So that's what you said in one of the sessions that we had on ThinkFest. Do we have the space for that?
Not the NSA, but my portfolio of strategic policy planning. One of the tasks I have is to think big, think prospectively, and not allow the system to remain or to get caught in a tactical kind of mindset or syndrome and forget the strategic part. So there we are doing a lot of work. We have done a lot of work, and this is not going to be visible. The nature of this work is not visible. It's not meant to be visible. But let me just say this much to you. The amount of coordination and clarity we have in the system right now, quite frankly, I don't think has been there in the past. And the reason for that is very simple. As a team, we are in a concerted manner talking about how to bring clarity for the long run. So you asked me where Pakistan stands. I was just speaking the other day to the Atlantic Council in the US, trying to explain to them that their narrative and their view of Pakistan is dated. How? Because they talk about Pakistan as a hard security issue, which used to happen all those years that I was there. Afghanistan is the issue, terrorism is the issue. Pakistan's moniker right now is economic diplomacy for the world and a welfare state internally in Pakistan. What is economic diplomacy? Not selling this or selling that or buying this or buying that. It's a paradigm. And the paradigm says, I want to focus internally. I want to improve my economic baseline. I want to talk to the world on how I can get medical tourism, services, get my entrepreneurs employed through software houses in the world. How do I connect this economic part to political relationships? How do I ensure that wherever my political relationships are good, I get maximum benefit for my economy? Wherever my economic relationships are good, how do I leverage that for my political relationship? This is a paradigm shift. This requires new thought in our departments, in our ministries. It requires more and different kind of coordination between the civilian side, between various institutions. And all of that is being done as we speak for long-term benefit. You can ask me, well, what does it do tomorrow? Nothing. But that's exactly how countries should evolve their systems. We're looking at the long-term dividends out of this. Do we have the capacity to analyze? Absolutely. I'm not going to say we're perfect. We have a lot of weaknesses. Any developing country does. We have a lot of things to improve. But let me very honestly tell you, there is not, I know what you're hinting at, quite frankly, in this question. There is not a chance of any kind of disconnect in this security, national security, foreign policy space, because all our actors, the Foreign Office, my office, the economic side, civil military, sit on the same table, coordinate, and decide to move forward with one voice and one direction. And I hope all of you have seen this with the Kashmir sort of policy. You'll see this in others as well. So I think we do have the capacity. Yes, it's a different approach and mindset, but you will start seeing results over the medium term, not tomorrow.
Right, Moeed. Thank you so much. Pleasure as always. More power to you. Thank you for giving us a sort of background to what's happening and what the thinking is. Now, before I go to Colonel Xizhong, Elizabeth, and I know it's really very early in DC, and I don't want the effect of coffee to wear off, but I wanted you to hear what Moeed had to say so you could get a view from this side. But now I want to hear from you about the thinking in DC with reference to China and India, and then India and Pakistan. So over to you.
Thank you, Ejaz. I'm happy to be with you. I think the view from DC right now, it's really important and helpful to put this over the long-term perspective. You yourself said in the intro, how actively Senator Biden, Vice President Biden has been in this to date. But I think it's also important to realize that this, in terms of the U.S.-India strategic partnership, is something that both sides of the aisle have pursued dating back to the Clinton administration, through Bush, through Obama, and indeed now through Trump. And so seeing this as more kind of a strategic longer-term alignment, I think is helpful in this current political moment to put things in a little bit of broader perspective. And so looking forward, with respect to India, I think it's right to to consider that in the grander scheme of things in terms of great power competition with China, with Russia to a lesser extent, that's certainly the lens through which this reframing seems to be seen right now in Washington. While we obviously, in working on South Asia, focus a great deal on India, the U.S. is also mindful of what's seen as Chinese aggression elsewhere in Asia, in East Asia and in Southeast Asia as well. And so it's not something that's necessarily exclusive to the South Asia region or indeed the India-China border dispute. And with respect to Pakistan, I think what Dr. Moeed was mentioning in terms of the economics of the relationship, that's something that we will be watching going forward, particularly as we anticipate a U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and really a transition of the paradigm that the U.S. has been engaging in South Asia for the past 19 years. And so it really does seem like a time when the sands are shifting to a certain extent, and there's an opening for different kinds of cooperation and coordination beyond just the security space.
Okay, this is interesting. I will, of course, return to you with reference to the US-Pakistan relations, because, as you know, there's been a lot of discussion now of where these relations are likely to go, the old transactional nature of the relationship and the rest of it. But I want to bring in Colonel Xizhong on the point that you made with reference to Chinese aggression elsewhere. So, Colonel Xizhong, it seems to me that the thinking in Washington, D.C., is essentially looking at China as a rival power, and some of the things that China is doing, for instance, in South China Sea or in Hong Kong or elsewhere, that China needs to be contained. Now, if this thinking informs policy in Washington, D.C., how does China propose to counter this? I mean, in a cooperative framework or in a conflictual framework?
Actually, in the history of 5,000 years, China has never invaded any country, everybody knows. And we would like to have cooperative development with all the countries. And also, America is very important for China. China is very important for America. Of course, we wish to have normal relations, cooperative relations with the number one economy. So far as the region is concerned, we propose to establish, to develop a kind of, regional cooperation. All the regional countries, China wishes that, we have cooperation, we have development, so that, South Asia, because South Asia is very important with such a big population. China has such a big population. If China and the South Asian countries have cooperation for economic development, then almost 40% of the world's population will benefit. That's our wish. But however, we have problems here and there, and we have to deal with them. But China is trying its best to, solve these problems, and we can, be back on the way of cooperation in the days to come.
Right, but just to, sort of get your thinking on this further, for instance, when you say that China has never invaded, somebody, a detractor, would turn back and talk about Xinjiang, Tibet, and the rest. Then, while you talk about the cooperative framework in terms of the BRI and the rest of it, connectivity, somebody is going to talk about, the sort of militarization of South China Sea and the fact that the littoral states there are particularly concerned. So, how would you respond to this kind of criticism?
And actually, the main problems are from America, because China is developing so fast that don't want to see rise of the emerging market economy, so that they can continue the global hegemony, so they can continue to control the world. And according to its own interests, the United States keeps changing its policies. And for example, on the Kashmir issue, the American president has repeatedly said that he will play a kind of mediating role. But up to now, I've not seen any action by the United States. So America can do nothing to mediation. If really America is involved in some regional issues, then the regional issues will become more and more complicated. So that's why I say actually America does not want to see a kind of stability in China, in South Asia. So they don't want to see the improvement of relations between India and Pakistan. And of course, they don't want to see solution of the Kashmir issue. I can see that. And also, they wish to see more and more problems between China and India, because China and India are two big powers in the region. So if the two countries, China and India, continue to have problems, then America can, can fish in the troubled water. Actually, these days, China and India are having military and diplomatic communications. Both sides have a strong desire to maintain the trend of cooperative cooperation, and also to maintain the peace, the stability along the border. Because the border is so long, more than 2,000 kilometers, from time to time, and because of some misunderstanding, and because the Indian side crosses the border, the line of actual control. So then, sometimes
I understand that, Colonel. I understand that. Since I'm also running short of time, let me go back to Elizabeth here. Now, Elizabeth, the interesting thing is that if we look at it in a structural realist kind of framework, then one can say that South China Sea, what China is doing is its Monroe Doctrine, something that the U.S. Should be able to perfectly understand. But having said that, and that is where obviously the controversy, or shall I say the discussion is, in terms of how this will pan out. Now, would it, within those structures, essentially be about moving into a Thucydides trap, or the two sides can actually begin to think of some kind of cooperative strategies in order to sort of tone this down and have a more, how should I put it, a more rules-based world order, accepting that it's no more a unipolar world. But what I see in Washington is almost a non-discussion of the possibility of a cooperative framework. How does one explain that?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and one that will be increasingly coming to the fore in the months ahead, I would say. South Asia is a really interesting region in this respect. We were actually discussing a couple of days ago, but to my mind, at least, there is a great deal of overlap in South Asia between Chinese and U.S. interests. For example, in terms of stability in Afghanistan, where both sides have been quietly working together for the past several years to try to bring a negotiated solution. And likewise, in managing crises and trying to discourage escalation in situations between India and Pakistan. Neither side, and indeed, as Dr. Moeed was saying, no one in the world has an interest in seeing two nuclear powers butt heads. And so I think the challenge going forward is going to be recognizing this framework and the increasingly competitive relationship between the U.S. and China. Is there room for cooperation on areas of mutual interest? And how is it possible to carve out those areas and to insulate them to a certain extent from the broader bilateral ups and downs? This is something that I anticipate will be going on for years in the future. And so developing the structures in terms of the U.S.-China relationship to build in a little bit more predictability and stability, even as we still likely will be competing, so that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, so that we can still identify those areas where our interests do mutually align, and through those, hopefully start to build a little bit of trust and regain some of what's been lost in the relationship.
I absolutely agree with you, but here's the problem. As I said, this is host. These are not the areas that are being discussed. All that is being discussed in Washington, for the most part, is how to punish and contain China. And I think that is a surefire recipe for returning to another cycle of a different kind of Cold War.
Yeah, it will be a challenge going forward. And, I sometimes hear it described as the U.S.-China relationship is an aircraft carrier, and it's been moving in a certain direction with the U.S. support for China, for example, joining the WTO for the past several decades. And that ship has started to turn. And it took quite a while for that to happen, but now that it has turned, it's going to be difficult to undo some of what's being done and just the way that China is perceived. And indeed, as you yourself mentioned, there are serious concerns about what's happening in Xizhong, what's happening in Hong Kong, what's happening in the South China Sea, what's happening in the Mekong Delta region, and indeed what's happening on the India border, where Chinese encampments are still present 100 days after the beginning of this border dispute. And so I think to the U.S. perspective, those are areas of serious concern, and it's difficult to move forward and try to establish a cooperative framework when those issues are still active and causing problems for our partners and allies in the region. And going forward, it will be a difficult balance to strike for whomever enters the White House in the next administration.
I understand. I think I wish I had more time for discussing this, but the takeaway seems to be that China and also Pakistan looks at the United States approach and finds that the United States is already biased in favor of India, and therefore its approach to whether it's the Eastern Ladakh line of actual control or Kashmir or elsewhere is becoming India-centric. But thank you so much, Elizabeth Threlkeld, Colonel Cheng, Xizhong. We shall take a short break and return to discuss a report by the Afghanistan Analyst Network on violence in Afghanistan. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Our second story tonight is about a report by the Afghanistan Analyst Network on violence in that country. The report says that it draws on two data sets, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project and UNAMA's reporting on the protection of civilians in the war. The report's significance lies in the fact that cessation of violence has so far eluded Afghanistan. Despite the February deal between the US and Taliban and the recent Loya Jirga that has paved the way for an intra-Afghan dialogue, violence has so far continued with a break on Eid al-Azha. Further, there are other extremist groups like Daesh, which continue their attacks. In the event, it becomes even more important for Kabul and the Taliban to come to an agreement on ending violence so other terrorist groups can be taken out. To discuss the situation further, we have Maryam, a journalist and activist who joins us from Kabul, and Norah Niland, co-founder of United Against Inhumanity. She has worked in Afghanistan on various occasions and set the UNAMA civilian casualty recording program in 2008. She joins us from Geneva. Let me begin with Ms. Niland. Ms. Niland, as I said, there's a lot of talk about talking, and that's in and of itself, frankly, very positive, given the background of what has happened in Afghanistan over the past 20 years. But the issue of violence is something that I think is extremely important, especially for the Afghan civilians. Give us a sense of, since you have worked, you started the UNAMA casualty reporting program. What is your sense of how difficult it would be to put an end to this?
Bringing warfare to an end, of course, is a somewhat different story. I think they're related, of course, because knowledge of the human costs of war should mobilize all of us to bring it to an end. It's a big discussion as to whether the agreement in February between the United States and the Taliban movement is a step in the right direction. Anything, obviously, that reduces armed violence is a positive. But as we've clearly seen, to a significant extent, it was part of the United States' exit strategy in Afghanistan. And having been part of a wider program that has created a lot of havoc and harm for Afghans, it would be important to see how the United States continues to position itself in relation to Afghanistan. And of course, not just the United States, but Afghanistan's neighbors and the wider world.
Let me go to Maryam here. Maryam, one of the things that the Loya Jirga resolution says is about a complete end to violence. It's not about reduction in violence, but it's about a ceasefire. And they also said that now, from the other side, the Taliban side, that there should be no hemming and hawing and no conditionalities and the rest of it. So what is your sense of where this might go when talks begin in Doha later this month?
I must say that the consultative Loya Jirga did write out quite a good few points. However, they didn't take into consideration that it might not be accepted by the Taliban. So the complete ceasefire, there has been no mention of this by any member of the Taliban or any spokesperson. And the fact that there's so many other spoilers in Afghanistan that are quite active, such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, how would we be able to determine which one, such as the MSF attack that we had recently, where President Ghani then changed the decree into attack mode from the ANDSF versus a reaction combat mode. So I'm quite concerned on how the future will uptake it, especially with the recent report that the Taliban mentioned that they don't recognize the government. And this is another shocker to me. Are the Taliban are they not looking at the best interests of the Afghans is what concerns me. And with their recent activities and their recent statements, I'm starting to notice that they don't have the best interests of Afghans at heart. And it seems that, again, it's just power struggle amongst the leadership, whether it's in the government or within the Taliban.
It's interesting that you say this, but let's try and look at it from another perspective, which is that in situations of insurgency and occupation, violence and conflict itself is one of the negotiating tools. So while the Taliban may not say something straight off, because that's an option that they would like to keep alive, do you think there's a possibility that when the talks begin, and I'm not talking about the spoiler elements of Daesh and Al-Qaeda, because that's a separate issue altogether. We're now talking about a dialogue that has been approved by over 3,000 participants of the Loya Jirga. So do you think that there is a possibility that something along the lines of perhaps firstly, a reduction in violence could be achieved? After all, we have seen last Eid also, recent Eid al-Azha also, that when the Taliban want to cease fire, they cease fire across board. So I think if they want to do it, that can be done.
I was in Afghanistan when the first ceasefire happened, and I had engaged with some of the foot soldiers, and I had noticed that there is a willpower from the Afghan Taliban foot soldiers to reintegrate within society. So we don't understand what the agenda talking points of the intra-Afghan negotiations would be. Now, it all comes down to communication. So when the intra-Afghan negotiation does take place, the agenda points here are, okay, if there will be ceasefire, what will happen when any of the ceasefires are violated? How will we move forward? These are really critical elements, and that's will help us determine on how to move forward. How sensitive is this process going to be? Then you also have the fragmented Taliban branches. So you have commanders who are not willing to reintegrate within society and want to continue conflict. Now you also have, what have the Taliban been saying for the past so many years is that the Afghan government is a puppet to the West. Now that the West have agreed mostly to leave, the Taliban cannot continue that narrative anymore. So why are they fighting their own Afghan soldiers when they said that they would only fight foreigners? These are the confused elements of recent events that I am quite shocked to see how I am still positive that hopefully they can reintegrate within society. But I'm concerned with the recent statements that where is the goodwill gesture from the Afghan Taliban? It seems that they have been pressured into the ceasefire. Whereas I feel that the Afghan government has also been pressured to come to the negotiating table. So when you see two parties pressured to come to the negotiation table, does that mean that that negotiation is going to be extremely fragile? And if terms are not agreed, will it break?
Right. Let me go back to Norah Niland. Ms. Niland, let's go back to shall I say, the original sin. Now, I know hindsight is 20/20, but what is the balance sheet here in terms of, starting with the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan? What are the gains? What are the losses? And how does the balance sheet look?
Well, huge question. And I think obviously the best people to answer that are Afghans. I mean, clearly some have benefited, especially those abusive power holders, and they are quite significant from before and now. Where the balance sheet sits, it depends on what metrics we use. I mean, what is it? Something like 60%, more than 60% of Afghans are less than 25 years of age. So there is much that can be learned from the past, but also, if I can say, much that can be learned from the future in terms of what are we doing in terms of taking into account the wishes of this growing population, and including, of course, the women of Afghanistan. I mean, there have some women and girls have benefited, whether it's from better healthcare services, although it's still pretty limited, including in particular the combination of armed conflict and COVID really stretches what healthcare facilities they are. I mean, I read something recently, something like 172 hospitals in a population of 37 million. And as we've seen in recent times, not recent, but in this past while, deliberate attacks on healthcare facilities, the same for education facilities. And what the Afghan Analysis report also highlights, pulling on the data made available by the UNAMA Protection of Civilians program, is that there's an increase in targeted attacks on civilians. That's all very bad news. So going forward, in terms of trying to reduce and then cease the violence and learning from the past, I think it's important that any peace process actually reflects the interests and the concerns of the Afghan people. And it's easier to do that in principle nowadays than it has been in the past. And when I say that, because I was in Afghanistan during 2002, I worked in Afghanistan during the Taliban regime period. And I remember at the time arguing that more NGOs and a significant cohort of women should have participated in the Bonn Agreement. That didn't happen. So to conclude, the prospects of peace are there if we listen to the desires and aspirations of the Afghan people who, 4 decades into this conflict, are more desirous than ever of silencing the guns.
I couldn't agree more with you, Ms. Niland. Unfortunately, those Afghans who suffer the most remain the most voiceless and powerless segment in this conflict. But thank you so much, Norah Niland. Thank you to Maryam Wardak for speaking with us. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.